Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Reinventing America's Schools this afternoon for a webinar that is a series in webinars that we do on public education. We are a project of the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., a centrist think tank that for almost 35 years has been offering radically pragmatic solutions to policy issues across all sectors. And also, I would like to mention that today this webinar is co-hosted, or co-sponsored, I should say, by the 74 Million. The 74 Million is another national nonprofit, a news organization that covers all manners of things, education from pre-K all the way through college and career. So if you haven't checked them out, you can find them at the 74million.org, and we thank them for their co-sponsorship. So Reinventing America's Schools believes that in order to save public education, we need to reinvent it. And never has that been more true, in our opinion, with the current situation of states rushing to sort of one-up each other and passing all these voucher programs that are diverting public dollars into private schools universally, whether there's a financial need or not. So our radically pragmatic answer to that is to give parents more agency over their children's education and to create more public school choices for them and better public school choices for them. So I'm really excited to be focusing on Denver, and in particular, the panel that we have assembled here today. All of these folks know each other. They've worked together in some capacity or another, and they all have a lot of really interesting things to say about what's happening in Denver these days. I'd also like to mention that I think the timing of this webinar is really good because there is a very important school board election coming up in Denver in just under 3 weeks, and it's one that national education reformers and, of course, local parents and voters are watching closely. So with that out of the way, I am going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves and to speak of their work. And of course, we will go with ladies first, and State Representative Jennifer Bacon, if you can unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Certainly a reunion of sorts from us on the call. My name is Jennifer Bacon. I am currently the state representative of House District 7 in Colorado, which is the far northeast corners of Denver. Prior to this, I had the privilege of serving on the Denver Public School Board, representing District 4, which is the east side of Denver. And I had the privilege of actually serving in both of those seats for my first legislative year. So it was an incredible experience. I think I'm really delighted to see my colleagues here on the call. My tenure on the school board came at a time where we were asking critical questions about some of the systems that we created. And I've had the opportunity to follow the conversations, not only at a city, but state level, and also have the opportunity to work on some legislation in the area of innovation schools. So I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Representative Bacon. Honorable James Coleman, Senator from the great state of Colorado. You're next.
Thank you so much. Hi, James Coleman, State Senator for Senate District 33. Also proud to be a constituent and also the Senator for Jennifer Bacon, my state representative. And I'm also the founder of Faith Bridge, a nonprofit organization dedicated to bridging and building relationships and resources for our children. I think something that's really powerful that we're doing here in Colorado, we'll touch on more, is making sure that the voices that are normally not at the table when it comes to education conversations are. Proud to serve at Faith Bridge with our executive, Vernon Jones, and our team.
Thank you so much for being here today. I know you have a really busy schedule. We all do. Dr. Nate Easley, could you introduce yourself next, please?
Sure. Nate Easley, former school board president and current education consultant, been in education for over several decades. And I really want to thank you guys for using my old picture. It makes me look so much better and younger. None of this frosting on that picture. The lion's share of my consulting is with an organization called School Board Partners, where I have somewhere between 20 and 25 school board members across the country, mostly people of color, mostly people who are in leadership positions on the board. And I get a chance to tell them how to avoid the mistakes I made when I was school board president, and take advantage of the moment that they have to be in charge of people's tax dollars and their kids.
That's extremely important. Thank you so much for doing that great work. And thanks to all of you again. And to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll do our best to get to them before the webinar's over. But if we don't, and you leave some contact information, we'll circle back. So today I'm going to talk just for a minute, and then I'm going to get to you guys. We're going to look at—
Just a second, Tressa, we forgot about Alex.
Oh, I am so sorry.
Yeah.
You
It's
are
not the first.
I promise, not forgotten.
No, it's not the first time I've been forgotten. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, Alex Magana, Executive Director of Beacon Network Schools, also Executive Principal here in Denver Public Schools. I had started this journey back in the day when innovation came around. And then I was asked to open a second school and worked with the community and families and teachers in designing a unique model to serve our kids. And we turned around 2 schools, which we're really proud of. So I'm excited to be here this year and share my story.
Thank you so much. And I promise I'm going to make that up to you. So today we're going to look at education reform in Denver kind of through 2 separate lenses. We're going to look a little broadly at the history, the trends, where we started, where we are now. And we're also going to look a little bit more specifically, as Alec mentioned, about the innovation school models and some political activity that's been going on around those schools. So if you think back to the early days of chartering, there were really 3 cities that were doing really robust chartering that everyone was kind of watching around the country: New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and Denver. New Orleans, of course, was just emerging from the suffering of Hurricane Katrina. The state had taken over the city's schools. And in Washington, D.C., Congress had created the D.C. Charter School Board. So in neither of those cities was chartering happening under an elected school board. That was not the case in Denver. Denver had an elected school board when it started its robust reforms and chartering movement. And so there's always been a little bit of a mystery, a little bit of a concern. Is Denver going to be able to sustain the reforms and continue to grow and progress from them, as election cycles come and go and board members cycle on and off the board? Would the reforms be sustainable? And of course, folks like us at Reinventing America's Schools really hope they would, because it was really undeniable that we were seeing progress for students, especially low income students and Black and Brown students. And I'm going to throw out a couple of statistics here. So in the 2005-2006 school year, more than 11% of Denver public school students were dropping out, and fewer than 39% were graduating high school on time. Fast forward 10 years to 2015, only 4% were dropping out, and the graduation on time rate had risen to 67%. Also, in 2005, DPS students were lagging behind their statewide counterparts' averages in both reading and math by about 25%. And in 2016, another decade forward, that gap was down to about 4%. And just a note, if you're wondering why I'm using older numbers, kind of towards the end of the Obama years, Denver switched its state testing. It went to a more Common Core type standard. And then, of course, we've also had the pandemic over the last 3 years, and the makeup of the school board has changed fairly dramatically in recent times. So it would be really awkward to compare, wouldn't be fair to compare numbers before and after. And so that brings me, speaking of the board, to a particular event that sparked today's webinar. When it became clear that autonomous schools were seeing student growth in DPS, the district actually looked for ways to create more of them and more autonomies for its traditional schools. They first allowed the creation of innovation schools, which could waive many district policies and collective bargaining rules. And then in 2015, a group of innovation schools actually won the right to create an innovation zone. And the distinction between innovation school and innovation zone is that innovation schools are still subject to board governance, whereas the zones have their own independent board that provides accountability and that the schools answer to. So I'm going to make it up to Alex by letting him go first. He told us a little bit about the Beacon Network schools, but tell us a little bit more about how your zone came to be. Why do parents choose your zone for their kids? And what kinds of things were you accomplishing through this recent spring?
Thank you. I was a principal. I was a principal at an innovation school at Grant, and we created Grant Beacon Middle School. At the school, we created a unique model, right? So that's the part where we were asked by families and also by the community, and at that time, superintendent, we were supported by the board of replicating. So we replicated and went into another school that was a highly impacted area. And it was an exciting opportunity to replicate a model that showed success. And similar to what CMOs have done, charter management organizations, I was like, you know what, can we do this as an innovation management organization? So we went into the school, we shared resources, we shared ideas. I was the executive principal, at the time, but then changes started to happen in opportunity within the district, but also not along with that, there were opportunities of, well, could we form a zone? And forming a zone allowed us to have board members that are close to the work to continue the supporting the model. In all fairness, in a traditional urban setting, board members are responsible for thousands of kids and hundreds of schools. They can't meet the needs of all. So my mentality was like, well, can we set up this zone for Beacon, where we have two schools, Kepner Beacon and Grant Beacon, with the idea that we would expand, and we have a board that's a community-driven board, and that board would oversee the executive director, and they're responsible for raising funds, promoting advocacy. So those are the initiatives, and we reported, and then that board technically is still responsible to the district DPS board. So as we launched, it was great to have parents on our board, teachers on our board, community members on our board, and focusing on the programming that we were providing, to our kids. And as an executive director, I would tell people I had 7 bosses, right? And they would, report to me, but we were still accountable to the DPS board and also to the superintendent. That's a little bit about how we launched it. The benefits were that because we had so many great structures at the initial school, when we went over to Kepner Beacon, we were able to maintain it. And then unfortunately, COVID hit, and it hit everyone, and that's understandable, and it impacted. The one thing I am proud of, that because of our forward thinking of us being able to have students even with one-on-one technology, which was not the norm across the district or in other schools, our students were able to at least maintain and have the opportunity to maintain. We still have a lot of work to do because the gap is, did widen with that. But our kids are flourishing and doing well. And right now the school is doing well and showing good high growth.
That's good to hear. But there's been a change in your innovation status. Is that right? And we can get into more details later. But am I correct in saying that you've kind of lost the autonomy that you had before?
The schools are still innovation schools, and we're in the process that's outlined by the Colorado State Law, the Innovation Act. The schools are in the process of still maintaining the innovation, being innovation schools. The zone itself was recommended for revocation. So the zone was revoked due to various reasons. But we were still given the flexibility with the superintendent after he saw the additional data, and also that we would operate as an IMO, initial innovation management organization.
Thank you. Senator Coleman, Alex referenced the state law. There's a charter school law and there's an innovation school law. Can you tell us a little bit about the protections that are in the charter school law that do not exist in the innovation school law, and talk about the bill that you authored last session? I believe it was Senate Bill 197, and what you were seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate the question. So in short order, if there's a decision made by a local school board about a charter or innovation zone, felt strongly that there should be another ability for a community to be able to weigh in and say, look, we hear what the elected board is saying, but we also want to advocate on behalf of our innovation zone or our charter school. And so that was a policy that I had an opportunity to run in a recent year, along with Representative Bacon, with a lot of stakeholding, a lot of conversations. It was a very tough bill. As she and I remember, it came down to the wire the last day of session, almost last couple of minutes. But ultimately, I think the goal of that policy was to be able to say that if there is an elected board that with information and knowledge of making a decision they believe is best on behalf of a innovation zone or on behalf of a charter, that ultimately they have a right, they're duly elected to vote how they want. But that being said, we wanted to have a measure by which the teachers, the school leaders, innovation zone, for instance, the parents, the kids, the students could have an additional voice through the state board. And so our ability to pass that bill worked. We were able to get it done. But I think, again, it goes back to what I said of the work that we're doing, even in my nonprofit experience with Faith Bridge, is there's a lot of decisions that are being made after we vote, right? Election days happen, they come and go, elections have consequences. We know that. But I think that doesn't mean that the community stops being involved in the conversation. And so we wanted to be able to have the community further involved in the conversation about what happens when it comes to a decision made by a local school district and their board. And that was ultimately what that bill did. And I think that, that is a direction that we're moving in terms of making sure that there's a community involvement, that there's trust by community of us as elected officials, myself as well. Rep. Bacon and I will tell you, we go to House district meetings, town halls, because although people vote for us, we want to make sure that we're continuing to be informed and advised by them, even though we are elected to go and take votes and run bills on their behalf in order to hopefully make education and all issues better, right? And so this is an opportunity through that bill that we ran to hear from community more. And ultimately, we hope that it results in us continuing to have high quality options for our kids.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when the charter school statute passed, it gives, at this point, it gives charter schools the right to appeal to the state board if there's a renewal decision or a revocation decision or an application decision that does not go in the charter school's favor. And it's my understanding that if the board rules on that, it is binding or somewhat binding. Whereas in the case of the innovation school, it is simply a recommendation, and the local authorizer, in this case would be DPS school board, is under absolutely no compunction to follow that recommendation, and they can revoke or deny at will. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it just furthers the conversation.
But that's not how the bill was when it passed out of the Senate. Is that correct?
I can't recall, Rep. Bacon, how did that bill pass out of the House and come back over?
It was not how it was passed out of the Senate. The negotiation pieces and what's critical there, you asked the question on the difference between charter and innovation statute. There's quite a few. And what is critical about this is that school districts aren't just authorizers, they are operators of innovation schools. And so the pushback was, the step, what is fundamentally different about charter schools and networks is that they are autonomous. And there needs to be some sort of mediator or arbitrator in between districts, where zones and schools, innovation zones and schools, are not. And so that was the point of tension with being able to go to the state board. There's nowhere written in any statute before this bill, two things, that the state board intervenes on decisions on innovation status. What they functionally do per statute is approve the plan or not. And the other thing is that the way Denver has pulled together their zones with what we call autonomous boards is unique to the state. And so there was a tension around what levels of autonomy there are, because there was nowhere written in statute the role of the state boards to make decisions between the two entities, because the way the statute was written was that the school district is the operator of innovation school as well. And so the way that it came from the Senate had it more positioned as if they were a charter network, right? With their autonomies, than not. And by the time the bill left the House, it had become that the state board would be a space to receive an opinion, but it would not be binding.
Well, hasn't there historically been tension in DPS between the board and the central office and the autonomous schools over the level of autonomy? And isn't it also true that when there's greater autonomy, there tends to be better student performance and student outcomes, as we see with charters?
Well, I think it's actually very fascinating to have Dr. Nate Easley on this call and Jennifer Bacon on this call quite honestly, because between the two of us, we have 10 years, right, of experience of these questions. And I think, you know, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. I think Dr. Easley was quite honestly like very brave and strong in putting on the table the changes that our district needed to see. By the time I got to the board, we had questions on, you know, were these things taking us where we wanted to go, but also what kind of adjustments do we need to make? And so the data question is not a simple yes or no. I would say that there's certainly evidence of critical mass, you know, of the autonomous schools and being able to do things. But if you follow Denver public schools, even in the last couple of years alone, we are still having questions on data. And so I just don't want to hide that ball either. But the big bet for us was to take on autonomy. And we did learn. I was a teacher in New Orleans Parish Schools in 2005 and 6 when that was happening. I was in DC in 2008 and 9. And we did learn and watch what was coming west to try to make some adjustments. You know, our choice system is very unique because of that. And so the questions that our district had been grappling with for a decade was around autonomies. And does it get us where we need to go? Because we made that a big bet. But also, what do we need to understand about balances? We have different choice data now than we had 10 years ago to see how people are making decisions about schools. We have a different enrollment environment now, right? When it comes to our number of schools, that the data has not been the same as it was 10 years ago. So I don't want to say that autonomies didn't get us progress. It certainly did. But there were some big questions that we need to answer on ways to function that quite frankly were unique. And I know this now to Denver versus the rest of the state. You know, I do talk to other school districts on how they use innovation status. I know this is not the point of this conversation, but it is very different. And so I think for what it's worth, we still have some questions to answer and how to make, you know, kind of like all boats, right? And all of those things to really lean into the best practices and best learnings of autonomies.
I guess I just don't understand how returning control of governance to a very distant DPS board that's responsible for thousands of students and hundreds of schools, as Alex pointed out, is an improvement vehicle for a school that has students that have struggled so badly through the learning loss of the pandemic and are marginalized in other ways. But we'll come back to that because I also want to talk about a little bit about your history as dean of one of the larger charter schools in Denver, and I want to find out how your thinking may have been changed by autonomy, because it seems like you've had a lot of experience with that. But I want to give Dr. Easley a chance to weigh in. You were the DPS school board president when a lot of these big, bold reform moves were initially being undertaken. You started your career as an elected school board official, as a teachers union supported candidate, but you broke ranks fairly quickly with the anti-reform position on the board. Can you give us a little bit about your experience and talk to us about what was accomplished or what you sought to accomplish during that time?
Sure. So I decided to run with the teachers union because I was not the chosen person for ed reform, and I was not patient enough to wait my turn. I decided that I wanted to run, and the time was then, and that regardless of whether I was chosen or not, I was going to run. And so that's what happened. They embraced me. But I will say neither the ed reform side or the teachers union side really knew me. I had only been back in Denver for a year. So I was barely eligible to run for a school board. Not many people knew me at all. So the fact that I won is surprising. The fact that I ascended to the board presidency is shocking. And I'm certainly not going to attribute that to me. It was just the circumstances. When the union candidates won, there was a big question whether or not we were going to fire the new superintendent, who was not only ed reform, but one of the foremost ed reform superintendents in the country, Tom Boasberg. I didn't know Tom. And to be honest with you, I was pretty naive when it came to union versus ed reform. But I do know student outcomes. And so I did a lot of homework. And I found out that the highest performing public school in Denver at the time was Denver School of Science and Technology. which is a charter school. And when you talk to Bill Kurtz, who's the CEO of DSST, he'll tell you that a big part of that was his autonomy. And so he would agree with you, Tressa, that being able to be autonomous allowed him to be more innovative and do things. And so, always looking for the shiny thing that's going to make the difference. I started to be more about autonomy, more about choice, more about those things than the teachers union had an appetite for. And so we parted ways. And as a result of that, they will say that they didn't lead a recall against me, but I will say I know for a fact that the folks who were working on the recall efforts were union employees. And they weren't successful. And so he pushed me even more in the ed reform wing of the school board. Now, if you ask me to reflect on that, because I came off the board in 2013, so it was like 10 years later, if you're looking at results in Denver of students, I would say, although we did some things like raised enrollment, as you pointed out, test scores went up, college enrollment went up. There was a lot of really positive things. The mistake that we made was we didn't bring the people with us. We got ahead of the people. And so the board flipped over and a lot of the things that we done were dismantled.
By people, do you mean parents and voters in the district, or do you
I mean parents, voters, especially in my home community of Montbello, where we reformed the high school. And I just think we used terrible language. We said we were closing it and reopening it, and we should never say close, because people of color always get things taken away from them, from government. And we weren't trying to take the high school away. We were trying to make it better. We probably should have used different language. We used horrible language because the school was never shuttered. That being said, we still left the folks behind. And when subsequent votes came up, the board turned over to a 7-0 pro-union board. And if you look at student performance in Denver Public Schools right now, it's horrible. I like to keep the pictures of my parents and grandparents in my background because I think I'm riding on their shoulders and their parents and grandparents. I think they'd be really disappointed in all of us, union side and ed reform, on student performance right now, and that there's not more emphasis on student outcomes. When you listen to board meetings, there's a lot of talk about student safety. There's a lot of talk about gender neutral bathrooms. But not enough talk about, are we teaching our third graders to read by the time they're in fourth grade? Are our students graduating? What happens to them when they graduate? Where do they go? And so regardless of what you do, I think things that we can do better is when there is something that is working, we should try harder to figure out what is it about that model that's working and can we replicate it? I wish that we would treat charter schools the way they were originally intended to be, places of innovation that are designed to be replicated in other places, and not necessarily islands of excellence.
How would you compare how they were treated then and how they're treated now in Denver?
Oh, we were very friendly. We gave charter networks brand new buildings. We really worked hard to bring extraordinary charter leaders into Denver. We were known as a very friendly to not only charters, but autonomous schools. We did things to strengthen our innovation schools.
How would you say that's changed to where you are today?
I'd say Denver right now is, like as Alex pointed out earlier, we're making it very hard for any autonomous school, even the ones that are high performing. And since there's no statute that protects innovation zones, then the district's going to do whatever it can to limit the power of innovation zones. I think when you look at labor and just talking about it unemotionally, labor's job is to make sure the teachers have the best deal. And it's difficult when people get exceptions to the union contract. And to have some autonomy, you have to get exceptions to the union contract on things like hiring, firing, the length of a school day, the length of a school year. And so when you have a completely pro-union board, then you're not going to be friendly to anything that's going to be an exception to the union contract, because that ultimately weakens your power to negotiate and get good salaries. So I think we're in a bad place all around.
So when you have 73% of white DPS students in grades 3 through 8 meeting or exceeding expectations, but only 20% of Black students and 24% of Hispanic students, what do you say to the board?
I say that every single meeting, 80% of your time should be focused on how to improve student outcomes and how we can replicate things that are working. Tressa, as you said that, I almost felt like my grandmother over here was going to go grab a switch and come out of that picture and turn me over her knee. And she's going to be looking at the rest of y'all too, Alex and Jennifer and James, because, you know, our ancestors weren't allowed to read, period. And the fact that we're somewhere around 20% proficiency for people who look like us. And if you talk about boys, I'm sure it's worse, right? It's like we're not honoring them with our leadership. So it's frustrating, but there is hope, because there still are schools like the ones that Alex runs that are doing some things that actually work. So the question is, how can the adults stop this whole jet shark thing and get really focused in on what is working and how do we grow that, regardless of whether it's happening at a district school or a charter school? And what can we do to be better at teaching kids to read after this horrible pandemic took us back 20 years? That's what I would hope we can put more emphasis on, and not necessarily on the means, but the outcomes.
So there's so many pieces of, so many threads of the things that you just said that I want to ask the others to respond to, but I'm going to start with Alex, since his schools are the ones that are feeling the immediate impact of the revocation of the autonomy, its own board. I understand you're still an innovation school. I understand you have promises from the superintendent, but we don't have a track record of promises being kept yet, because this is all so new. So I don't want to put you on the spot, because I know your number one concern is your kids' success, and you're committed to working with the district in this new capacity. But when Nate talks about having a 100% union supported board and these reforms coming to a grinding halt, you know, what does that look like on the ground to the families that you serve?
One is family. Thank you. Families want, they don't get involved with this part. They just want good quality schools. And that's one of the things that we learned over the past couple of years. We're like, oh, okay, this is a charter, and we talk about charters, and it took a long time for charters to actually get to the point of being recognized as an organization. The past couple of years, we were pushing to get recognized as an innovative model, right? And then we did all kinds of communications with our families and community members of what that looks like. But when it comes down to the families, they make a connection with the teachers, with the programming, how they, you know, all the things that are good for the school. The benefits of innovation allowed us to, and I always push for it regardless of, and it's unfortunate that we continue to go into ed reform versus union. It should never be about that. It's always got to be about kids and what we do. 100% of my staff voted in favor of our plans. So why would that ever change? You know, now I know that many of them are part, you know, of that. With that being said, giving the schools of creating a unique model to support the children making quick adjustments and changes. I learned a lot from the charter schools. I mean, you can call me whatever you like, but I learned, I'm like, oh, we have to have clear systems, a clear vision, everyone on the same page. How do we get to that? Well, one is develop a plan and commit to a plan. And when you're talking about huge districts of 100,000, people, how do you get everyone on the same page? It's close to impossible. But can you be strategic and start small and then spreads out and then innovative ideas start to form? Absolutely. And many of the innovation schools let innovative ideas actually were part of the district's future strategic plans as they moved forward. That's, I mean, to the parents, they've appreciated, valued our school because of the unique things and opportunities that we provide. Keep in mind, the two schools that I was at, the first one and the second one, they were underperforming. It was under-enrolled. People didn't want to be a part of it. Why? We were not addressing the needs of the kids walking through the doors. I can sit and talk to adults all you want. I need to go, listen, we got to get on the same page. And there is the accountability component.
So I'm going to move on. I want to move on to our state elected officials, but just a final little follow-up on that. Having been through this process of having the school board, for lack of more sophisticated term, come after Beacon Network schools and using evidence, if you will, that wasn't really part of what the evidence should be in considering revocation, and then going through the appeal process at the state. Do you think Senate Bill 197 as written is adequate for zones and schools like the ones you run? Alex, can you hear me?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were directing that one to the.
No, I'm sorry. Maybe I was.
Repeat the question.
Do you think Senate, having been through what you've just been through over the last year, do you think Senate Bill 197 as written is adequate, or do you think it needs to be revisited?
I'm very proud of the fact that there was a decision made at the board level, the local board member. We were able to talk to the state board level at the state board, and our families were heard. It was probably it was a big event for that, where they actually acknowledged the work that we were doing in that. That being said, I wish there was more influence, or however you want to say it, at the local level to make that decision. Now, we did not push it any further as an organization. We decided to pause, and that was our decision. And I was able to work with the superintendent of where are we going with it. But it would have been nice to have some more, not support, but just strength behind that decision and recommendations made by the state board. Yes.
So I'm going to pull another thread from what Dr. Easley said, and I'm going to direct this to Representative Bacon and Senator Coleman, although I think Senator Coleman has his camera off. I'm hoping he's still with us and he didn't have something urgent come up. Dr. Easley said they did a terrible job, the reformers, and how they talked to the community, how they spoke of reform, the terms they use, the failure to engage, educate, bring people along to meet the moment. I'm wondering if that has changed in the light of the pandemic and all that parents have witnessed over the last 2 to 3 years, and the polling. It's really, really clear that the toothpaste is kind of out of the tube. Poll after poll after poll says that parents want more choice rather than less. And in many places, that choice is taking the form of universal vouchers, which has its own set of accountability concerns for me. And I know accountability is the big thing with you, Representative Bacon, as it rightly should be. But now that the community has come to a new moment, is it time for state lawmakers to increase choice, and particularly perhaps since Denver is a blue city and a blue state, is it time for Democrats to start paying more attention to what parents want when it comes to choice? I'll let you go first, Representative Bacon. Senator Coleman may have stepped away, I'm not sure.
Senator Coleman's on. We can see him.
Yeah,
I don't know why I can't.
You were directing that too.
I thought maybe I was just really stoic and not moving, and you thought my camera froze, but I can see you pressing. Go ahead.
It's just a black square, but I see you now. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Go ahead, Red Bacon.
You know, I have to say, Tressa, this conversation is much more nuanced than I want to be sure that we talk about it here. Because I'll say this, Senator Coleman and I represent the same neighborhood. I follow Dr. Easley in the seat. And I don't think it would actually surprise many of us here if I told you our parents didn't actually care about governance type on the first round of things. You know, they care that their kids are first safe, that their kids get from A to B in their learning, that they can be productive, right, after they're 18. And now in Denver, and more so in our neighborhoods, because at this point, myself, Dr. Easley, and Senator Coleman all represent the same neighborhood, that our kids are seen for who they are and that they are developed into the leaders that they can be for this community. Our kids demand that they are taught and developed in self-efficacy. And so when we talk to our neighbors, what they want are schools that can provide that for them. As someone who kind of lived through it, I was an educator through it before I even decided to run for school board. We have become more familiar with the terms, and our networks and our zones have done a great job at organizing families, and particularly elevating those voices. But, you know, if a school, regardless of governance types, provides those three things, they'll go to it. And that's what choice has shown us, you know? Our data for choice has kind of stayed around the same. At least I transitioned off the board in 2021. So that just 2 years ago, we were not a 7-0 board. We were 5-2. I was also endorsed by the union. However, I spent 10 years working for Teach for America. I tried to open a charter school. So, you know, the problem is narratives try to put us in boxes where we couldn't authentically show up for our communities. And those conversations were the tough ones, like I'm bringing up here. So our choice data showed, you know, in the far northeast of Denver was a very big pilot. It started with the closing of our high school. We have a bus system that picks kids up and takes them to different schools that doesn't exist across the city because choice also needed to come with tools to be able to support all families and being able to exercise it. And after 10 years, our data was very mixed. There were high performing schools, DSST did very well. There were some that were chartered that were not. We had alternative schools. We had every type of school. And we found that families would they choiced out, especially in not a heavy choice neighborhood like mine, they'd only choose out for programming, right? Most people still chose the elementary school closest to them. Most people still chose the middle school closest to them. And so we had to figure out how to balance all of those things, right? And so I do think that families, for what it's worth, we've done a good job here in Denver, and that families do know that they can engage with their education. Not every family believes they fully can. I think we still have some work on the reality of engaging. Like if you don't have a car, if you want to go to school elsewhere in the far northeast, it takes an hour and a half on the bus. You know, so that's not really choice. What is the burden on the low-income families to exercise choice? But our families know that there are people out there who will support them in elevating their voices, and it came through schools. And that's something to actually be very proud of in our community. However, we as a district,
I agree. Reinventing America's Reinventing America's Schools really does believe in the portfolio motto. We think that there should be choices for parents who want to send their child to a neighborhood school, to an arts-centric school, a STEM school, culturally intensive school. We think the more choices for parents, the better. So I think Denver is to be commended for approaching that portfolio model. But I also know that there's a huge body of evidence that said the more autonomous the schools are, and the more the decisions for the children are made at the local level, the more certain it is that Dr. Nate Easley's grandmother's not going to come off the wall with a switch because kids are going to be getting a better education. And I just think there's a sense that Denver has reversed a course that was working for many years. Maybe it wasn't working at lightning speed, but it was showing steady incremental progress. And I'm just curious as to whether, given also the change in the larger national education conversation and climate, that parents want more choice, if there's something that the legislature in Denver, as being the arbiter of state statutes, could do to be more responsive to parents who are seeking that right now.
And before you jump over to Senator Coleman, I really want to say this, because I think what happened in our neighborhood was that what we were saying was not matching what people then became to believe were choices. choices. And that is how someone like me got elected. I did work at the network you're talking about, but that last point I made about student efficacy, for example, I ran a whole big piece of policy called the Black Excellence Resolution. And actually we pulled the data for Black kids. And in 10 years, all we saw was at best 20% of Black kids were on grade level. And that was across governance type. And so the other thing that we know too, is that if we're gonna say choices, we have to actually provide those. And our communities did not feel like we were. We did not have an art school that was funded well. And so then when parents say we want to save our kids for our academics, they're going to be pushed to a certain type of school. We had whole revolutions when it came to culture in those buildings. Should we walk silently in hallways? And to not say that those things didn't exist while also telling families they had choices would miss the whole point, I think, of what we're trying to do as a matter of policy. And so it's not enough to just say autonomy. We have to understand what that means. And we have to be able to find accountability levers to actually be responsive to families. And that's what we've been contending with underneath a lot of this for the last 10 years. And I hope it's not a point that is missed in it. That is where some of the political pushback came from. It wasn't just because we are union. It was, I don't know how many times my son is going to be sent to the office for talking. And when we do a lot of these policies and they're in heavily Black and brown neighborhoods, those things are very critical to contend with as a matter of execution of what we say simply in statute. And so I just didn't want us to miss that point, because that is something that we have learned, but it's also where some of the pushback came from to figure out what we can do. So what do you do when a whole school staff votes to not be an innovation? What do you do when you audit an innovation school's curriculum and it's found culturally detrimental? We have to be able to balance those things as well.
I think that happened in one of the other innovation networks, and the school teachers made the decision to exit the network. And that is, to me, as how it should be, because the way it works is if the teachers want it and there's a plan that's approved, it becomes an innovation school. I think the concern is when you have a situation like Beacon Network schools where 100% of the teachers voted, 100% of the teachers are devoted, the plan is approved, that without, real significant opportunity for remediation, it's simply stripped. But I don't want to get too in the nitty gritty of that. And I feel like I haven't let Senator Coleman weigh in. So please weigh in on what my question was or respond to Representative Bacon. You have the floor.
I think the answer that Dr. Easley gave a long time ago is the answer to your question on whether or not there's an appetite for choice and whether or not parents in Colorado want to have that. And the short answer is yes. The little bit more added on to that is it's choices that are happening with us and not to us. And that was the point he was making, right? And so I believe that there were well-intentioned efforts. There always are. In theory, these things sound really good. But when you do not have practical implementation for making sure that parents have agency around what kind of school choice options there are, that's when you end up in the situation that we're in, period. That is it. No one wants to hear, not no one, but some people don't want to hear that. It just is what it is. We know what's best based off of data. We know what's best off of best practice. We know what's best based off of what other states are doing, but we don't always know what's best because we're not going door knocking after the elections to talk to families and say, we know you're busy. We know you're working multiple jobs. We know you have multiple kids. We know you lack the capacity in terms of time to be able to engage in the way that we do. That's why you elect us. That's why you have great school leaders like Alex. That's why you have great board members like formerly Dr. Easley and now our state representative, Jennifer Bacon. But the goal, I think, in answer your question is that we actually give parents that agency to help determine what those choices are. And that those choices, given what they've demanded, are high quality based off of their definition, not based off of mine. My definition might be different than other parents, but I'll tell you, as a parent, take my state senator cap off of, you tell me that I don't get a choice on where I get to shop or where I get to live or where I get to, based off of the work that I put in, based off of my education, based off of all these pieces, then I have a problem with that. I think everyone would say, I know everyone would say, I would love to be able to choose this option if it's afforded to me. How do I afford that? And that's what we have to get back to. So a lot of well-intentioned effort. I don't think anyone's evil in this conversation. I think ultimately we have to make sure that we trust families, school leaders, teachers, to help us determine what high quality choice options look like in Colorado.
So what role, I guess, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be difficult, but what role does the legislature play when parents are using their agency and their voice as much as they can?
Yep.
I mean, obviously listen, obviously knock doors, but when you're hearing and when polls after polls after polls are saying we want more choice.
I'm actually not hearing anything. See, that's the problem. And the polling is not being done by the community. The polling might be coming from some trusted source, but we need to actually hear from families directly. That's the problem. We're not actually hearing directly from families when we're making these decisions. A lot of the decisions that Representative Bacon and I are being influenced to make are based off of who's in the lobby. It's based off of who's being who they're representing. And while we appreciate that they're there and we do go to them for advice and perspective, our job is to do what she does and I do, and that's actually go visit schools. To actually be in the community and talk to them, welcome them to come here. And so the data, the polling does not unequivocally say that we want one particular type of governance model. What it says is we want high quality options. Our job is to pass policy. We're policymakers. And so if the policy ultimately says, man, I really believe, again, Alex is a case in point, 100% of my entire network, right? Whether it's the teachers, whether it's the school leaders, whether it's the parents and the kids, they're telling me that they need this and want this. Then it's our responsibility to run a bill the way that we did. And then it may be an opportunity for us to go further, but we have to hear from them and say, we need you to do this. And by the way, we run a bill, it doesn't just pass in Denver. The bill passes across the state, right? And so we have to do our due diligence to engage all of our colleagues. We need 33 in the House and 18 in the Senate. Our job is to show them how we're having the same conversations in their community. Those conversations aren't being had. Those are the challenges that we have, and we have to make sure we're hearing from community as well as the rest of the ecosystem advising us on policy.
So Dr. Easley, I think we're talking about the same thing, just separated by several decades from your position as an education consultant now, along with your history on the board. What does the good schools, good outcomes, I won't call it the reform community, but those that are advocating and agitating for reading, writing, and arithmetic, what do you advise them? How do they mobilize?
I would suggest, first of all, let me just say that every middle class, and I'd say probably the upper half of income earners, definitely the top quartile, has choice, and we will not take it away from them, period. So the debate about choice is whether low income folks have a choice, number one. Number two, if you give me a choice between Shop and Go and 7-Eleven, that's not really a choice if I want healthy food, right? I mean, you might, with all due respect, I don't want to get sued by Shop and Go or 7-Eleven or the Quickie Mart or whatever.
We'll bleep it out.
I'm probably not likely to find the healthy stuff that I could get at Sprouts or Nature Foods or all those that are in my neighborhood where I live in Denver versus my sister's neighborhood in Montbello, which her options are, okay? So to Representative Bacon's point earlier, how do we help low-income families make a good choice, an informed choice with quality options, right? So number one, I think choice has to be built in. Number two, you absolutely have to focus on quality where it exists, which means you have to look at data. You have to know who is doing it right, because there's always anomalies. There are schools in Denver that are doing an absolutely amazing job teaching kids how to read, right? So how do we raise those up so that we don't get caught in some ideology of pro-union or pro-ed reform, but instead look for things that work. In education, we are really good at talking about the many ways that we suck. We're challenged talking about what we do well, right? We usually bury the story, bury the lead in the story, and the story is we're horrible at what we're doing. That's not true in every case. All of us have had absolutely amazing teachers from elementary school all the way through through college, right? How do we raise those teachers up? How do we make sure we make it difficult that they leave us, right? I just think this whole Jet Sharks Ed Reform versus Union is a distraction to
I,
focusing on
I
what
agree. I
works.
agree. I agree. And I think we all agree of that. I think we're all sick of it. I think parents are sick of going to school board meetings every Tuesday night or every second Thursday night or whatever it is, and screaming and yelling for hot water in their bathrooms or SROs returned or whatever the issue is.
Yeah.
But I think the fact of the matter is that a lot of times data is ignored and things are done on emotion. And I think that there is a track record now, and I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that every charter school is a good one. That's why we close them. That's why the accountability system is there. And I think authorizing has improved dramatically over the 3 decades that we've had charter schools. And it really encourages me, especially when I see in places where it was the wild, wild west in the beginning, it encourages me to see them really actively pursuing good authorizing policies and trying to learn from NACSA and others as to what makes a good authorizer. What's the right balance? How long should that charter extension be? But you said something very important about teachers. And so I'm going to go back right now to the only person on this panel who's currently employing teachers. And Alex, I'd like to hear from you on teachers and their role in these battles. Or forget the battles. I hate that word. I think a lot of well-intentioned people trying to come at a good solution to problems from very different angles.
I'm going to quote a friend of mine that said to me, results are the currency of autonomy, right? So there are accountability measures that we need to make sure to focus our kids on. The one thing I asked my teachers prior to once innovation got started was, do you want to make the changes or is someone else going to make the changes? We were not performing at the level it needed to be. We were run by the district, and I'm talking way back when Dr. Easley was the board member. When we were given that flexibility and autonomy to really create something unique and special with the teachers in the building, that's where it took off. Because now you have buy-in. It was never about the contract, and it's not like, listen, on this is what we're committed to doing. Is everyone on board? And then we set up systems to support it. Just know that it has to produce those positive outcomes. It might be changing times. It might be adjusting salary positions of what the responsibilities are. It might be schedule changes. It could be the curriculum, writing the curriculum, giving teachers extra time, giving staff members, and I'll say educators, bringing everyone together. So I'm proud of the fact that every time we've renewed our innovation plans, we've always exceeded the criteria. There's a 60% vote. And we were, the lowest vote we ever got was 85%. So even on the last one, we were at 100%. But you bring the teachers along, and educators along, and parents and community members. We can't lose sight of that.
How's morale following everything that's happened to Beacon Network schools with the teachers specifically?
I think once we found out what the next steps are going to be, and just pausing for a second and let the dust settle, we're all about kids, and morale it's challenging times, but the morale is good, in the schools, because we're focusing on it. We're still able to do some of the things that we were doing before, because you're talking about the fear piece. Last year, it was challenging, due to the fact that what was being said and heard.
I said it to you in a pre-call a couple of months ago, but I find your lack of ego in all of this just incredibly refreshing. And the fact that kids always come first with you, no matter in good times or bad, is just extremely impressive. Okay, we're almost out of time. I want to do a quick lightning round. This is really important. I want to hear from each of you what you would like to see the new board members, so the election's in 3 weeks, there's 3 seats up, probably at least some of those will be people who are not currently on the board. What is your advice to them? What is your charge to them? We'll just go straight down the line. Dr. Easley?
Focus on student outcomes. Avoid the net zero sum game. Don't have winners and losers.
Perfect. Alex?
Escúchanos. Listen to the families, listen to the people in the buildings, listen to the educators and the leaders. But escúchanos, listen.
State Representative Bacon?
I agree in that there are things that we should be focusing on. Every school board member should know at all times how many kids are on grade level. And I think as well, we need to have some vision and remind ourselves that we are here to serve and listen to families and find the appropriate tools that get there, even though those tools may want to divide themselves in you.
I love what you said about knowing how many kids are on grade level. That's extremely astute. You can't fix it unless you know where you're at and what you need to do. And finally, Senator Coleman, you get the last word.
Have the same expectations for all children as you do your own.
Love it. Love it. That's great. Well, we'll see what happens in Denver 3 Tuesdays from now. In the meantime, I want to thank all of you so much for your time and for being willing to have a kind of uncomfortable conversation at time and a frank conversation. Gotten a lot of little notes in the chat that this has been a really helpful conversation. So I really thank you. And I think it was an impactful hour. Appreciate it.